There is a man in the Gospels who is set free on the most consequential morning in Christian history, and then the text simply stops following him. He is named 4 times, in 4 different books, by 4 different writers. And then he walks out of a Roman holding cell into the light of a Passover morning, and not one line of scripture, not one letter of any church father, not one page of Josephus or the rabbis or the Roman records ever tells us where he went. If you grew up hearing this story, you were handed the surface of it. A murderer set free, an innocent man condemned, a crowd shouting the wrong name. It is the tidiest moral picture in the Passion, and it is the version that gets preached, and almost none of it is where the real strangeness lives. Because here is the detail that should stop you. In some of the oldest copies of Matthew's Gospel that we know anything about, this man is not called Barabbas. He is called something else. He is given a first name. And that first name is one that a 3rd century Christian scholar, reading it in his own manuscripts, said out loud should not be there, because no wicked man in all of Scripture is ever called by it. I am going to show you that name. I am going to show you the manuscripts it survives in, the men who tried to remove it, and the reason the standard scholarly edition of the Greek New Testament today prints it in brackets, meaning the committee could not agree and did not want to decide for you. And I am going to be honest with you about the other half of this story, which is harder, because the whole scene turns on a custom, a governor releasing a prisoner every Passover, at the crowd's choice, and that custom appears nowhere. Not in Josephus, who wrote thousands of pages on this exact period. Not in Philo. Not in the entire body of rabbinic law. Not in any Roman legal source that survives. Nowhere on earth except these 4 Gospels. So the question underneath this whole story is not the one you have been asked to care about. It is not really what kind of man Barabbas was. The answer has almost nothing to do with his biography. We have none. And almost everything to do with a word that scribes could not bring themselves to copy. And a custom that no historian outside the Gospels ever recorded. If you want to walk through this with me, subscribe and turn on notifications so the next part of the story finds you when it comes. And leave a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read them, and I like knowing who is out there in the dark with me. So let us go back to the cell, and to the morning, and to the 4 accounts that do not quite agree. Part 1. The man who has no life. Start with what the text actually gives you, because it is less than you remember. Mark, the earliest of the 4, introduces him in a single sentence, and then never returns to him. He writes that there was a man called Barabbas, in prison with the rebels who had committed murder in the Insurrection. Read that slowly. The Greek is more slippery than the English. The word for those rebels is stasiastai, insurrectionists, men who took part in a stasis, a civil uprising, and the murder is attached to them, to the group, in that uprising. Mark does not say in so many words that Barabbas himself killed anyone. He says Barabbas was imprisoned with men who had. That is not a technicality invented by modern skeptics. It is a feature of the Greek that commentators have been noting for a very long time, and the scholar Joel Marcus, in his major commentary on Mark, flags how awkward the construction is right at this point in the chapter. Notice something else. Mark writes the one called Barabbas with the definite article, the way you refer to someone your audience already knows. He does not explain who this is. He assumes you know. Which means that when Mark was writing, the name still meant something to somebody. Then Mark tells us the crowd came up and asked the governor to do what he usually did for them. Usually, we will come back to that word, and we will spend a long time on it, because it may be the single most contested word in the scene. Now go to Matthew. Matthew calls him a desmion apismon, a notorious prisoner, a marked prisoner, a man conspicuous enough to be known by name. Matthew drops Mark's specific reference to the insurrection. He does not say which uprising. Davies and Allison, in the great critical commentary on Matthew, argue that this is not a denial that Barabbas was an insurrectionist. It is more likely that Matthew, or Matthew's audience, simply did not know which particular revolt Mark had in mind. The memory had already gone soft. Luke is blunter than either of them. Luke says twice in the same passage, that this man had been thrown into prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city, and for murder. Luke attaches the killing to Barabbas directly, and Luke's whole architecture in that scene is built on the exchange, the guilty man handed back to the crowd, the innocent man handed over to their will, and then John, who tells us the least of all. John gives him one word. Barabbas was a lestes. That word is usually translated robber, or bandit, or brigand. It is a word we are going to have to fight over later, because in the hands of Josephus it does not always mean what it looks like it means. 4 accounts. 4 slightly different men. An insurrectionist held with killers, a notorious prisoner, a murderer, a bandit. And outside those 4 passion narratives, the entire New Testament mentions this episode exactly once more. In the book of Acts, Peter stands in front of a Jerusalem crowd and says that they denied the Holy and Righteous One and asked instead for a murderer to be granted to them. He does not use the name, but there is no one else he can mean. Now here is what none of them give you. No age, no trade, no hometown, no family beyond the one buried inside his name, no motive, no description of his face, his build, his voice, no account of his arrest, no account of his trial, if he ever had one. And this is the part I want you to hold on to for the rest of this. No word whatsoever about what happened to him after the door opened. He is not mentioned again in Scripture. He is not mentioned in any letter of Paul. He is not mentioned in the book of Revelation. He is not mentioned by Clement, or Ignatius, or Justin, or Irenaeus, or Tertullian, or Eusebius, in any passage that tells us his fate. The church fathers who do discuss him, and some of them discuss him at length, are interested in what he means, not in where he went. Nobody in the ancient world seems to have known, or if somebody did, they did not think it was worth the ink. He steps into history for the length of one shouted decision, and then history closes over him without a ripple. Most stories about missing people are stories about a search. This one is not. There is no search, because there is no trail. What there is instead, and this is where it turns, is his name. Because the name is the only piece of evidence about him that we actually possess, and the name is stranger than anything the Gospels tell us he did. Part 2. Son of the Father. Barabbas is not a name, not the way Peter is a name, or Mary. It is a patronymic, a description of whose son you are. The Greek Barabbas sits on top of an Aramaic phrase, bar-ab, and every first-year student of the language can take it apart. Bar is the Aramaic word for son of, the same word standing inside Simon bar Jonah, Simon son of Jonah, in Matthew's 16th chapter, and ab means father. Bar-ab, son of the Father. Now the moment you hear that, your mind does something, and I want to name what it does before we go any further. Because on that morning, according to the text, a man called Son of the Father was released, and a man who called God his Father was condemned. The mirror is right there on the surface of the language, and people have been noticing it for at least 1800 years. But before we let that mirror do any work, we have to ask the boring question. And the boring question is the important one. Is Abba an actual name that actual men had? Or is this too neat, a piece of theological architecture that some early Christian storyteller built and then handed us as history? And the answer to that is not a matter of opinion, it is a matter of stone. In the winter of 1970 and 1971, in a neighbourhood on the northern edge of Jerusalem called Givat HaMivtar, archaeologists opened a burial cave from the late Second Temple period, the world of Herod, of the prefects, of the Gospels. Cut into the wall of that tomb was an inscription of 7 lines. It was written in Aramaic, but in the old Paleo-Hebrew script, which is itself a statement of identity, a deliberately archaic hand. And it begins in the first person. I, Abba, son of the priest Eleazar, son of Aaron the Great. It goes on to say that he was born in Jerusalem, that he went into exile in Babylonia, and that he brought back a man named Mattathiah, son of Judah, and buried him in this cave. I want to be precise about what that proves and what it does not. There is a long-running argument about who the man in that cave actually was. One scholar, Yoel Elitzur, proposed that the Mattathiah buried there was the last Hasmonean king. Most specialists have not accepted that, and the physical anthropologist who examined the remains, Patricia Smith, concluded that the bones belonged to an elderly woman. That fight is unresolved, and it does not matter for our purposes. What matters is the first word. I, Abba, a real man, in 1st century Jerusalem, whose given name was Abba, carved into the wall of a real tomb that you can go and read about today in the Israel Exploration Journal, where it was published in 1973. And he is not alone. Open the rabbinic literature, and the name Abba is everywhere. There is a sage remembered as Abba Bar Abba, literally Abba son of Abba, the father of the great teacher Samuel of Nahadir. There is Abba Arika, born Abba Bar Ibo, the man the tradition simply calls Rav. There is Abba Saul. There is Abba Jose ben Hanan. The Talmud itself, in a passage in Barakot, makes a small joke about how common the name was. So here is the verdict, and it is a careful one. Bar Ab is exactly the kind of name a 1st century Jewish man would actually have carried. Son of Abba. Son of a man named Abba. It is ordinary. It is the ancient equivalent of Johnson. That is the position of Raymond Brown, whose 2-volume work The Death of the Messiah is the most thorough study of the Passion narratives ever written in English, and of Joseph Fitzmyer, the great Aramaic scholar of the last century. The theological resonance, Son of the Father, is real, and we are going to take it seriously later. But it rides on top of an ordinary name. It is not evidence that the man was invented. There is a competing reading, and honesty requires that I give it to you. A handful of manuscripts spell the name with a doubled letter, Barabbas rather than Barabbas, which would point to a different Aramaic root, Barabbas, son of the master, son of the teacher, son of the rabbi. And there is an ancient witness for this. Jerome tells us that a lost text called the Gospel according to the Hebrews rendered the name as Filius Magistri Aurum, son of their master. I find that genuinely interesting, and I do not think it is the answer. Neither does most scholarship, for a specific reason. The fixed titular use of Rabban as an honorific, as in Rabban Gamaliel, belongs to a later stage of Jewish history than the early 1st century. Reading son of the rabbi into this name imports a title that had not yet hardened into a title. When a proposal along these lines was revived in the middle of the last century, that anachronism is precisely the objection that was raised against it. So we are left with the ordinary reading. A man called Son of Abba, a patronymic so unremarkable that it tells us nothing about him at all, which leaves us exactly where we started, with a man who has a name and no life. Except that in Matthew's Gospel there is a place where the manuscripts do not agree about that name, where some copies, including, we are told, very ancient ones, give him something more. Not a description, not a title, a first name. And the moment you put that first name back into the text, the scene in front of Pilate stops being a contrast and becomes something much stranger. Something a great many Christians have never been told is in the apparatus of their own Bibles. Part 3. The name the copies could not keep. Open a modern critical edition of the Greek New Testament, the Nestle Aland text, the one used in seminaries and universities across the world, and turn to the 16th and 17th verses of Matthew's 27th chapter. You will find a word sitting there in square brackets. Isaun, Jesus. The text reads, "They had then a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. And Pilate says to the crowd, 'Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called Messiah?'" Those brackets are not decoration. In the conventions of that edition, square brackets are a confession. They mean the editorial committee could not reach agreement about whether the word belonged in the original text, and chose to print it while signalling their own doubt. In the companion volume that explains the committee's decisions, this reading carries the rating that means precisely that: the editors had considerable difficulty deciding. So let us look at what they were deciding about. Start with the manuscripts that have the name. There is Codex Coridethi, a gospel manuscript of the 9th century, written in a rough, untrained hand by a scribe who seems not to have been comfortable in Greek, preserving a text with Old and Eastern roots. It has the name. There is the group of manuscripts scholars call Family 1, a cluster of related minuscules including the manuscript known simply as 1, and another known as 1582, which is a remarkable book, copied in the 10th century but preserving notes and readings from very much earlier. Family 1 has the name. There is manuscript 700 in its original hand. There is a lectionary catalogued as 844 used for public reading in church. And then there are the versions, the ancient translations, which matter enormously because they can preserve a Greek text older than any Greek manuscript that survives. The Sinaitic Syriac from the 4th century has the name. The Palestinian Syriac has it. The Armenian tradition has it. And the Georgian tradition splits down the middle in a way that is almost poetic. The Addish manuscript, copied in 897, does not have the name. The Opisa manuscript from 913 and the Tibet manuscript from 995 do, now the other side, and it is heavy. The manuscripts that read simply Barabbas include Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, the two great 4th century Bibles, the most celebrated witnesses we possess. Also Alexandrinus. Also Bezae. Also the enormous mass of later Greek manuscripts that make up the Byzantine tradition and the Latin tradition and the Peshitta and Harkline Syriac, and the Coptic. If you counted witnesses like votes, this would not be close. The short reading wins by an avalanche. So why is Jesus in the text at all? Because of a man who read it in the 3rd century and did not like it. Origen of Alexandria was the most formidable biblical scholar of the early church, a man who compiled a 6-column parallel edition of the Old Testament, and who worked constantly with manuscripts. In his commentary on Matthew, at this exact passage, he records something. He says that in many ancient copies that he has encountered, Barabbas himself is likewise called Jesus, and then he argues against it. His reasoning is theological, and he does not hide it. The name Jesus, he says, does not belong to an evildoer. Nowhere in all of Scripture, he insists, is a sinner called by that name, and therefore it should not stand here. Sit with what that means for a moment. In the middle of the 3rd century, roughly 150 years after Matthew was written, a scholar with access to manuscripts far older than anything we possess reports that the reading Jesus Barabbas is sitting in many of the ancient copies in front of him, and gives a reason why it ought to be taken out. The English scholar Burnet Streeter made the point sharply a century ago The reading was in the text Origen was commenting on. It is the omission that Origen is recommending. That note attached itself to the manuscript tradition. In something like 20 manuscripts, a marginal comment, a scholion, preserves the observation about the very ancient copies. In one manuscript it is credited to Origen, in others it is credited to Anastasius of Antioch, or to Chrysostom. And here I have to slow down and be fair, because this is where good scholars part company. Metzger, whose textual commentary is the standard reference, thought the note probably goes back to Origen. Others are less sure. Dirk Jonkind, of Tyndale House in Cambridge, has argued that a single attribution in a single manuscript is a thin foundation, and Amy Donaldson's doctoral work on patristic comments about textual variants raised the same caution. The scholion may be the work of a much later writer, possibly Peter of Laodicea in the 6th century, summarizing something he had read. That caution is real, and I am not going to hide it from you. But notice that it does not touch Origen's commentary itself, which is a separate piece of evidence, and which is the stronger one. Now the argument that convinced a majority of the modern committee. It rests on a principle that runs through this entire discipline, and once you understand it, you will never read a Bible footnote the same way again. The principle is this: prefer the harder reading. Scribes were not villains. They were tired, devout men copying sacred text by lamplight, and their instincts ran in a predictable direction. They smoothed rough grammar. They harmonized one gospel toward another, and above all, they protected what was holy. Ask yourself which is more likely, that a Christian scribe looked at the name Barabbas and decided on his own initiative to bestow the name of his Lord on a condemned murderer, or that a Christian scribe looked at the words Jesus Barabbas, felt exactly what Origen felt, and let the sacred name quietly fall away. There is only one honest answer to that question. Nobody adds that name. People remove it. And there is a mechanical argument on top of the psychological one, which is where this gets genuinely beautiful. The earliest Christian scribes did not write out the sacred names in full. They abbreviated them, a practice scholars call the nomina sacra, the sacred names. Jesus was written as 2 letters, iota and nu, with a stroke drawn over the top to mark it as holy. Now look at the line in Greek. Pilate asks whom he should release to you. Hymen, and the next word is the abbreviated Jesus. And hymen ends in the same 2 letters that the abbreviation consists of. The text ran, letter after letter with no spaces between words, as ancient texts did, Ymin Barabbas. A scribe copying that, glancing up and back down, could very easily see the same 2 letters twice, and conclude that his predecessor had slipped. And he corrects the error that is not an error. The sacred name vanishes into the word in front of it. That is the case. Metzger's committee found it strong enough that a majority concluded the double name stood in the original text of Matthew and was suppressed for reverential reasons, but found the external support thin enough that they printed the word in brackets rather than plainly. You can see the result in the translations on your own shelf. The New Revised Standard Version prints Jesus Barabbas. So does the New International Version in its current edition. So do the New English Translation, the Revised English Bible, the Common English Bible, the Good News Translation, the Lexham English Bible, and the King James does not. Neither does the Revised Standard, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard, or the Christian Standard Bible. Westcott and Hort, whose 19th century edition shaped modern textual criticism, judged it a scribal error and left it out. So it is not settled. I want to say that plainly, because you will find people online who will tell you this is a suppressed secret, and people who will tell you it is a myth, and both of them are overselling. John Meyer, one of the most careful historical Jesus scholars alive, follows the external evidence and prefers the short reading. and one of the sharpest recent treatments by Robert Moses in the journal New Testament Studies, takes a position that cuts down the middle that the double name probably did stand in Matthew's text, but that this does not prove a historical prisoner was actually named Jesus Barabbas. It may be Matthew's own deliberate literary construction, which is a distinction worth holding on to, because whether the name goes back to Matthew's pen or to a man in a cell, the moment you read it, the scene changes completely. Part 4. Two men named Jesus. Put the name back and stand in the crowd. The governor comes out onto the pavement. There are two prisoners, and the choice he offers is not between a murderer and a Messiah, it is between two men with the same first name. Jesus Barabbas. Jesus called Messiah. Yeshua was one of the most common names in 1st century Judea, a shortened form of Yehoshua, Joshua, the man who led Israel into the land. There are dozens of men named Jesus in Josephus alone. Two prisoners sharing it is not a coincidence that requires explanation. It is a Tuesday. But look at what the crowd is being asked to do. They are being asked to distinguish. Which Jesus? And the only way to tell them apart is by what follows the name, by the father each one is named for. One is the son of Abba, the other calls God Abba. That is not my embellishment. The Aramaic word survives untranslated in the Gospel of Mark, in the garden, hours before this scene, when Jesus prays and calls God Abba, Father. Paul preserves it twice in his letters, as a word the earliest churches kept in Aramaic, because it was too precious to render. So the choice, as Matthew's Greek presents it, is between the Son of the Father and the Son of the Father. Now I need to be careful here, and I want you to watch me be careful, because this is exactly the point where a channel like this one could tip over into something dishonest. It would be easy to tell you that this proves something. It does not prove anything. What it does is reveal design. Whether that design belongs to the way events actually fell out on a Passover morning, or to the way Matthew shaped his account of them, is a question the evidence cannot close. Scholars who accept the longer reading disagree among themselves about exactly that, and I gave you Robert Moses' version of the disagreement a moment ago. What we can say is that if the double name stood in Matthew's Gospel, then Matthew is doing something deliberate, and his readers were meant to feel it. And there is a second layer, which is the word the crowd would have heard on the other side. Matthew has Pilate say Jesus, who is called Christos, Messiah, the Anointed One. That is a claim about kingship, and it is the claim on the placard that goes up over the cross. So the two men in front of the crowd are not simply a criminal and a preacher. They are two competing answers to the same question, which is the question the whole city is holding its breath over that week. What does deliverance look like? And who brings it? One answer had been in prison for an uprising. Whatever exactly he had done it against Rome, and there were people in that city who would have thought of him not as a criminal, but as a patriot. Hold that thought, because in a moment we are going to look hard at what kind of man the sources are describing. The other answer had ridden into the city on a borrowed animal and overturned some tables and told his followers to put a sword away. And the crowd chooses. In Luke's telling, they choose so vehemently that Luke uses the language of a verdict. Their voices prevailed. Now here is the harder thing, and I am not going to root around it, because this passage has a history, and that history has a body count. Matthew alone of the four adds a line after the choice. The crowd says, "His blood be on us and on our children." It appears in no other gospel, and for the better part of 2,000 years that single sentence was read as a self-imposed curse on an entire people, and used to justify things I do not need to describe to you. Martin Luther reached for that kind of reasoning in his notorious writing against the Jews in 1543. It has been in the bloodstream of Christian Europe for a very long time. Modern scholarship on Matthew reads that verse very differently. The German commentator Ulrich Luz, who wrote what is probably the most important commentary on Matthew of the last 50 years, calls it a redactional creation, Matthew's own composition, not a transcript. The crowd in the scene is described a few verses earlier as having been persuaded by the named chief priests and elders. It is a crowd in a courtyard on one morning in one city. And most scholars read the line as reflecting the situation after the year 70, when Jerusalem had been destroyed and a Christian writer was reaching for an explanation. I am telling you this because the Barabbas scene cannot be handled honestly without it. The choice between the two Jesuses is one of the most theologically loaded moments in the New Testament. It has also been one of the most weaponized. Both things are true, and a viewer who reads scripture seriously deserves to know both. So we have a name and a mirror and a scene built to make you feel the exchange. But I have been standing on the edge of a prior question this whole time, and if you have been listening closely, you have probably already asked it. How can anybody possibly know this? How do we know what stood in a document written 19 centuries ago when that document no longer exists? The answer involves a lost profession, a peculiar habit of abbreviation, and the fact that in the ancient world it was almost impossible to erase anything cleanly. Part 5. The Men Who Copied the Books. Let me tell you something that surprises people who have never had reason to think about it. We do not have Matthew's Gospel. We do not have the copy that came from the author's hand, the autograph as scholars call it. We do not have it for any book of the New Testament. We do not have it for Homer, or Tacitus, or Plato either. This is simply the condition of ancient literature. What we have are copies of copies, made across centuries, in different regions, by different hands, in different circumstances. That sounds like a catastrophe, and for the wrong reasons people sometimes present it as one. It is not. The New Testament is the best attested text of the ancient world by an enormous margin, thousands of Greek manuscripts, tens of thousands of copies in translation, and quotations by early Christian writers so extensive that scholars have observed you could reconstruct most of the text from the quotations alone. But that abundance has a consequence people rarely follow through on. When you have thousands of witnesses, you can see the disagreements. A text preserved in one lonely medieval copy looks perfectly clean because there is nothing to compare it to. A text preserved in thousands of copies shows you every place where the copies part company. The variations are visible precisely because the evidence is rich. That is worth remembering the next time someone tries to frighten you with the number of variants in the New Testament. The number is a symptom of how much survived. So, who were these people? For the first few centuries, largely not professionals. Christian books in the early period seem often to have been copied by educated members of the community, rather than by trained commercial scribes, which is one reason early Christian manuscripts have a distinctive, slightly workmanlike look. Later, in the monasteries, copying became an organized discipline. A scriptorium ruled lines. A practiced hand, sometimes a reader dictating to several copyists at once. Consider what that means physically. A man sits with an exemplar, the copy he is reproducing, and a fresh sheet. He reads a phrase, holds it in his head, and writes it. He reads the next phrase. Hour after hour. In the surviving colophons, the little notes scribes left at the ends of books. They complain about it, about the cold, about their fingers, about how the work bends the back and dims the eyes. Now the errors that creep in are not random. They are the errors of a mind doing exactly that task. The eye jumps from one occurrence of a word to the next identical word and skips everything between. Scholars call it a leap from the same to the same. The ear, in dictation, confuses words that sounded alike in the Greek of that period. The memory smooths an awkward phrase into a familiar one, and a scribe who knows one gospel by heart will, without any intention to deceive, write the wording he knows into the gospel in front of him. This is why textual criticism is a discipline and not a guessing game. The errors are patterned. If you know the patterns, the manuscripts tell you which reading generated the others. And now the habit that matters most for our story. Very early, so early that scholars still argue about how the practice began and how it spread so uniformly, Christian scribes started treating certain words differently, not translating them differently, writing them differently. God, Lord, Christ, Jesus, and a small handful of others. Instead of writing them out, the scribe would contract them to their first and last letters and draw a horizontal stroke above. Scholars call these the nomina sacra, the sacred names. And nobody has fully explained them. They are not ordinary abbreviations for saving space, because they appear even where space is abundant. And because ordinary Greek documents did not abbreviate this way, they function more like an act of reverence made visible. This word is not like the other words, and the pen will treat it differently. They also appear across the Christian manuscript tradition with astonishing consistency from very early on, in places geographically distant from each other. Whatever it was a shared habit of a shared community. And it means that on the page of Matthew we were looking at, the name of Jesus was not a word, it was 2 letters and a line. Which brings us to the last piece, and to why any of this is recoverable at all. In the ancient world, you could not erase cleanly. On papyrus, a wash or a scrape damaged the surface. On parchment, scraping left a visible thinning, and the old ink often ghosted back over time. And crucially, a scribe correcting a text usually was not trying to hide anything, he was fixing what he understood to be a mistake, sometimes by striking through, sometimes by writing above the line, sometimes by adding a note in the margin. Go and look at the great 4th century Bibles and you will see it. Codex Sinaiticus carries corrections by many different hands, laid down over centuries, later readers going through the text adjusting, disagreeing with their predecessors, occasionally disagreeing with each other. The book is a conversation. So when something is removed from a manuscript tradition, it very rarely goes quietly. It leaves scars. A stray reading in a Syriac translation made before the change spread. A cluster of related minuscules in one corner of the tradition that never got the memo. A marginal note. A version in Armenian or in Georgian translated from a Greek text that no longer exists, which is why those versions matter so much and why I named them earlier. A translation can be a fossil of a Greek manuscript that has otherwise vanished from the earth, and sometimes the scar is a man complaining in writing. That is what Origen is. His commentary on Matthew is the loudest scar of all. Whatever else you make of the manuscript evidence, you have a 3rd century scholar looking at copies older than any book we now possess, telling his readers what he sees in them and telling them why he thinks it should not be there. The name was taken out of most copies. That much is not seriously disputed by anyone. The only question is whether it was taken out because it was wrong or because it was uncomfortable. And the reason we can even stand here and ask the question is that the ancient world had no delete key. It could only ever write over. So we have gone as far as the page can take us. We have a name, a mirror, and the visible mark of an argument that Christians were having about that name within a century and a half of the crucifixion. What we still do not have is a man, and to get anywhere near a man, we have to ask what he was actually in prison for, and that turns out to open onto one of the great arguments in the study of 1st century Judea. Part 6. The Insurrection with no name. Mark writes the Insurrection, not an insurrection, the Insurrection, with the definite article as though naming an event that his readers could place. We cannot place it. There is no uprising in any surviving source that matches Mark's description, in a way that lets us pin it down, and that gap has made this one verse a magnet for historians, because we know a great deal about the man who was governing Judea at the time, and almost all of what we know is violent. Pontius Pilate held Judea from around the year 26 to the year 36. He is not a legend. There is a block of limestone that proves it. In 1961, an Italian team led by the archaeologist Antonio Frova was excavating the Roman theatre at Caesarea Maritima on the coast and found a damaged stone that had been reused as a step. Cut into it was a Latin inscription. It records the dedication of a building in honour of the Emperor Tiberius, and it names the man who dedicated it, Pontius Pilate, and his title, Prefect of Judea. That inscription is the only contemporary epigraphic evidence for Pilate's existence and office anywhere in the world, and it quietly corrected the historical record, because the Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, had called Pilate a procurator. The stone says, Prefect. It is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem now. You can stand in front of it. And what the literary sources say about the man who put his name on that stone is not flattering. Josephus records that Pilate brought military standards bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem under cover of night, an act that struck at the heart of Jewish law about images. A crowd went down to Caesarea and lay on the ground for 5 days and nights, and when Pilate surrounded them with soldiers and threatened to cut them down, they bared their necks and told him to strike. He backed off. Josephus also records something bloodier. Pilate built an aqueduct to bring water into Jerusalem and paid for it out of the temple treasury, the sacred fund. When crowds gathered to protest, Pilate had soldiers dress as civilians, hide clubs under their clothing, and mix into the crowd. At a signal, they began to beat the protesters. Many were killed, some in the crush of people trying to escape. Philo of Alexandria, writing much closer to the events, gives us a character sketch that reads like an indictment. He describes Pilate's inflexible and merciless disposition, and lists bribery, insults, plunder, outrages and executions carried out without trial. And Pilate's career ends the way such careers do. Around the year 36, he slaughtered a crowd of Samaritans gathered at Mount Gerizim, and the complaint went over his head, and he was recalled to Rome. So, was Mark's Insurrection the aqueduct riot? It is the strongest candidate anyone has proposed. The timing works. The setting works, a riot in Jerusalem, put down with lethal force, which would have produced exactly what Mark describes. Prisoners in Roman custody, associated with a killing, held over from a specific disturbance the city remembered. And I want to be exact with you, that identification is inference. Mark does not say it, no ancient source says it. It is a plausible reconstruction offered by scholars, not a fact, and anyone who tells you flatly that Barabbas was arrested in the aqueduct riot has crossed a line the evidence does not support. Now the word. John calls him a lestes, and this is where an argument opens up that has consumed a great deal of ink. In classical usage, a lestes is a robber, a highwayman, a brigand, someone who takes your goods with violence on a lonely road. It is the standard Greek equivalent of the Latin latro. But Josephus uses that word constantly for men who were fighting Rome. To the governing authority, an insurgent is a bandit. That is how governing authorities have always talked. So a substantial body of scholarship reads lestes in the Gospels as loaded political language, a rebel dressed in the vocabulary of criminality. The counter-argument is worth hearing, and it is simple. Greek had perfectly good words for a revolutionary. Mark himself uses one of them in this very passage. Stasiasts. If John had meant rebel, he had the word available and did not use it. Which brings us to a term you have almost certainly heard applied to Barabbas, and which I'm going to ask you to be careful with. Zealot. for most of the 20th century, the dominant reconstruction. Associated above all with the German scholar Martin Hengel and his massive study of the Zealots, described a continuous movement of armed resistance in Judea, running from the tax revolt of Judas the Galilean at the census in the year 6, straight through to the Great War against Rome 60 years later. On that reading, calling Barabbas a zealot is natural. That reconstruction has been substantially dismantled. Morton Smith and Richard Horsley, among others, argued that the Zealots as an organised party do not appear until the war itself, in the years 66 to 70, that Josephus's own account presents them as a faction that crystallised during the revolt, not a standing organisation that had been operating for generations. The Dagomen, the Sicarii, show up as a named phenomenon in the 40s and 50s. After Jesus. So describing Barabbas as a zealot imports a party that probably did not yet exist in the form the word implies. The honest words are the ones the text uses: an insurrectionist, a rebel, a man imprisoned after a riot in which people died. There is one more thread here, and I want to lay it out and then tell you where it stops. Mark and Matthew use that same word stai for the two men crucified on either side of Jesus. The same word John applies to Barabbas. You can see immediately where that leads. If the two crucified men were rebels, and Barabbas was a rebel held from a specific uprising with the men who had committed murder in it, then perhaps those two crosses were built for Barabbas's associates. Perhaps one of the three was built for him. Perhaps he stood in the crowd and watched two men he knew die in the place where he had been standing an hour before. That is a genuinely powerful thought. And it is speculation. The text neither states it nor rules it out. John, notably, drops the word entirely and calls them simply two others. If I told you that Barabbas watched his own comrades die that afternoon, I would be writing fiction and handing it to you as history. And that is the one thing this channel does not do. What we can say is smaller and stranger. 3 crosses were prepared. 3 men were expected. One of them walked away, and somebody else, a man from Nazareth, took the place that had been made ready. And that brings us to the mechanism, the thing that let him walk. The custom. This is where the ground gets soft. Part 7. The custom that left no trace. Every version of this story depends on one claim. Take the claim away and the scene cannot happen. The claim is that there was a custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover. Let us look at how each writer states it, because they do not state it the same way, and the differences are the beginning of the problem. Mark says the governor used to release for them one prisoner whom they requested. The verb is an imperfect, a habitual action, something that happened repeatedly over time. Matthew says the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. John does something different, and it is worth noticing. John has Pilate say, "You have a custom that I release someone to you at the Passover." Not "I have a custom." You do. John attributes the practice to the Jewish population as something Rome accommodated. And Luke is the strangest of all. In many Bibles you will find a verse in Luke's 23rd chapter saying that the governor was obliged to release one prisoner to them at the festival. In many other Bibles that verse is missing entirely, or sitting in a footnote. That is because it is missing from the earliest and best witnesses to Luke, including the great 3rd century papyrus of Luke and John, and the original hand of Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus. It appears in later manuscripts. The overwhelming scholarly judgment, including Raymond Brown's, is that it is a later addition, a scribe reading Luke alongside Mark and Matthew, noticing that Luke's account assumed a custom he had never explained, and helpfully supplying the missing explanation. Which tells you something quietly important. Even in the manuscript tradition, this custom was a thing that needed explaining. So, outside these Gospels, what is the evidence that a Roman governor of Judea released a prisoner of the crowd's choosing every Passover? There is none. I want to give that its full weight, because it is easy to say quickly and hard to absorb. Josephus wrote 2 enormous works covering this exact period in this exact province, the Jewish War and the Antiquities. He describes Passover in Jerusalem repeatedly. He is obsessed with the conduct of Roman governors, and he is not shy about recording their concessions to Jewish sensibilities. Because those concessions are part of his argument to a Roman readership that his people were not ungovernable. A standing annual amnesty at the greatest festival of the year, granted by Rome at the crowd's choosing, is exactly the kind of detail Josephus would have loved. He never mentions it. Philo does not mention it. The Mishnah does not mention it, and the Mishnah is a document that specifies what happens to the Passover lamb of a man who is ritually unclean, or on a journey, or elderly. It is a text obsessed with edge cases. The Talmuds do not describe it. No Roman legal source describes it. No inscription attests it. There is no papyrus recording it. The practice has a name in scholarship, the Paschal Pardon, or in Latin the Privilegium Paschali, and the name is slightly misleading because it sounds like an institution. It is a modern label for a gospel claim. Now, before anyone accuses me of stacking the deck, let me put the defence properly. Absence of evidence is a weaker argument than people usually assume, and it is weakest exactly where the record is thinnest. We do not possess the administrative archive of the Judean prefecture. We have no run of Pilate's edicts. Provincial governors had wide discretion, and local accommodations that lasted a few decades in one province could easily leave no trace in sources that were written for other purposes. Josephus's silences are not always meaningful. There are things we know happened that he does not mention. That is a real argument, and it is the argument that defenders of historicity make. It is not a trivial one. But notice what it does and does not accomplish. It explains how a genuine local practice could go unrecorded. It does not provide any positive evidence that this one did. And it has to work against the fact that the practice, as described, is not a minor administrative footnote. It is spectacular. A governor with the power of the sword, in the most volatile city in the empire, at the most crowded and most nationalistic week of the year, handing a convicted insurgent back to a shouting crowd on request. Annually, think about that as a policy. You are Rome. You have a city that swells with pilgrims and political heat every spring. You have a standing garrison and a history of riots. And your practice is to release, by popular acclamation, whichever prisoner the crowd shouts for, including, on this occasion, a man imprisoned in connection with an armed uprising against you. That is not a governor's concession. That is a governor manufacturing his own next insurgency, on a schedule. So the historians have a genuine problem, and it is not manufactured by skeptics. It is the reason this passage has generated its own literature, including a study by Robert Merritt in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 1985 devoted specifically to the question of the Paschal Pardon. And where scholarship has gone next is to look for parallels. Anything, anywhere in the ancient world that looks enough like this to make it credible. There are several candidates. Every one of them has been offered in good faith. And I want to walk you through them one at a time and tell you honestly how well each one holds up. Because this is the part of the argument that usually gets summarized into a single confident sentence in either direction, and the truth is more interesting than either summary. Part 8. The parallels that almost work. The first and most famous is a piece of papyrus. It is catalogued as Papyrus Florentinus 61, it comes from Egypt, and it is dated to the year 85, about half a century after the crucifixion. It records a hearing before the Roman prefect of Egypt, a man named Gaius Septimius Vegetus, there is an accused man named Fibion, and the prefect says something to the effect that Fibion was worthy of scourging, but that he will give him to the crowd. When this papyrus was published, it caused real excitement. The great scholar Adolf Deismann, who did more than anyone to show how the Greek of the New Testament was the Greek of everyday documents, pointed to it. Vincent Taylor, in his commentary on Mark, cites it, and you will still find it quoted today as though it settles the matter. It does not settle the matter, and here is why. Fibion had not been condemned. He was an accused man at a hearing, not a convicted prisoner awaiting punishment. The hearing was not at a festival. There is no indication of anything customary or recurring about it. What the papyrus actually demonstrates is that a Roman prefect, in the course of a hearing, might yield to the assembled public and let a man go. That is genuinely useful. It shows the psychology is not absurd, that a governor could and did release a man to a crowd. It is not evidence of an annual Passover institution in Judea, and treating it as such is more than the document can bear. Second candidate, a passage in the Mishnah. In the tractate Pesayim, in a discussion about who may have a Passover lamb slaughtered on their behalf, there is a provision covering someone whom they have promised to bring out of prison. This is the closest thing in all of Jewish law to what the Gospels describe, and it is the reason some scholars have argued the custom was real. There is a version of the argument made by Charles Chevelle in the Journal of Biblical Literature back in 1941. That traces a genuine pre-Passover release practice, possibly going back to Hasmonean times. But look closer, because the rabbinic discussion itself is instructive. In the Talmudic elaboration, Rabbi Yohanan draws a distinction. A promise of release from a Jewish court can be relied on, and a promise from a Gentile authority cannot, which is a fascinating window into how Jewish authorities regarded Roman assurances. But it is also the opposite of what the Gospels describe. The Gospels describe a Roman release that could be counted on annually. The Mishnah's provision reads more naturally as a person expecting release for any number of reasons, and the tradition's own comment treats Gentile promises as precisely the ones you cannot bank on. So, suggestive, genuinely relevant, and not the institution the Gospels describe. Third, Roman legal practice in general. Roman law did contain mechanisms of clemency. There was abolitio, the dropping of a charge. There was indulgentia, pardon. There was the very real phenomenon of acclamatio populi, a magistrate responding to the shouted will of an assembled crowd, which any reader of Roman political history knows was a live force. And there are festival amnesties scattered through Roman religious practice. Livy records prisoners being freed during an old Roman rite in the early Republic. All of that establishes that a governor releasing a man in response to a crowd is thoroughly at home in the Roman world. None of it establishes a recurring festival amnesty in a Judean province at Passover with the prisoner chosen by popular vote. Fourth, Josephus does record individual acts of release. Archelaus, at the beginning of his rule, released prisoners to win goodwill. The governor Albinus, at the end of his term in the 60s, emptied the prisons of ordinary criminals, which Josephus reports with disgust, because it filled the country with brigands. These are real, and they are documented. But they are political acts by individual rulers at particular moments. A new ruler buying popularity, an outgoing one clearing his desk. They are not an annual custom, and Josephus, who records them precisely because they were notable, would have had no reason to omit an annual one. So where does that leave the scholarship? It leaves it divided, and I am going to name the positions. On the side of historicity, Joseph Blinzler, in his detailed study of the trial of Jesus, defended the custom as plausible, and various scholars since have followed some version of that line, generally leaning on the thinness of provincial records. Against, Paul Winter, in his influential book on the trial, treated the custom as unhistorical, Samuel Brandon argued that the whole scene served an apologetic purpose. Chaim Maccoby argued that the release custom was introduced into the tradition after the year 70, when Christians had powerful reasons to distance themselves from Jewish revolt and to shift the responsibility for the crucifixion away from Rome. John Dominic Crossan regards the scene as substantially a literary creation, and in the middle, where I think the evidence honestly leaves us, sits Raymond Brown. Brown's position in the death of the Messiah is careful, and it is worth stating precisely because it is so often flattened in both directions. He does not affirm that a standing annual amnesty existed as an institution. He does not conclude that the whole episode was invented either. His treatment allows that something real may stand behind it, that a man named Barabbas may well have been released by Pilate in connection with the events of that Passover, while regarding the generalized framing of it as a custom, and the shape of the crowd scene as the work of the evangelists, serving their purposes. That is an unsatisfying answer if you want a verdict. It is the answer the evidence supports. And it opens onto the question I find the most interesting in this entire story. Because if the custom is doing literary work as well as historical work, what work is it doing? What is the scene for? The answer, according to a growing body of scholarship, is that Matthew is not primarily writing a courtroom drama at all. He is writing about the Day of Atonement. Part 9. The Goat That Was Let Go. Open Leviticus at the 16th chapter and read the ritual for the Day of Atonement. The high priest takes 2 goats. 2, and the text is emphatic that they are presented together at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Lots are cast over them. 1 lot falls for the Lord, and that goat is slaughtered, and its blood is carried into the holy place. The other lot falls for Azazel, and that goat is not killed. It is presented alive. The priest lays both hands on its head and confesses over it all the iniquities of the people, and the goat is sent away into the wilderness, carrying them. 1 dies, 1 is released, and lives. Now hold that beside a Passover morning in Jerusalem. 2 men are presented together before the authority. 1 is chosen and killed, the other is released and goes free, and walks away into a wilderness of the record so complete that not one ancient source ever tells us where he went. This reading is not a modern invention, and that is the part I find remarkable. Origen made the connection in the 3rd century in his homilies on Leviticus. He identified the goat that was released with Barabbas and the goat that was killed with Jesus, and he went further. He noticed that Leviticus prescribes that the man who leads the released goat away must afterward wash himself, and he set that beside Pilate, calling for water, washing his hands in front of the crowd. Cyril of Alexandria returned to the 2 goats typology in his correspondence in the 5th century. This is old Christian reading, not a 21st century thesis, but modern scholarship has sharpened it into something with real force. Daniel Stekel Ben Ezra's study of the impact of the Day of Atonement on early Christianity laid much of the groundwork, and in recent years the argument has been made in detail, including a substantial article in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 2020, that Matthew has deliberately shaped this whole scene as a Day of Atonement typology. And here is the detail that makes the hair on your arm stand up, if you have been following the manuscript argument. The Mishnah, in its tractate on the Day of Atonement, specifies that the 2 goats should be alike in appearance, alike in size, alike in value, bought, ideally at the same time. The ritual requires that the 2 be indistinguishable, so that the lot, and not the priest's preference, does the choosing. 2 figures who must be indistinguishable. 2 men with the same name. If the reading Jesus Barabbas stood in Matthew's Gospel, then Matthew has given his 2 goats the one thing the ritual demands: they cannot be told apart. The crowd is handed the lot and made to choose which Jesus lives. I have to put the brakes on here, and you would be right to want me to. This reading has critics, and their objection is a fair one. In Leviticus, the released goat carries the sins away, it bears them into the wilderness. Barabbas does not bear anybody's sins anywhere. He is simply guilty and simply free. So the mapping is not clean, and scholars who work on this material argue about how much weight it can hold. And there is a second function of the scene that runs alongside the theological one, and it is less comfortable. The Barabbas episode transfers the initiative for the crucifixion from the Roman governor to the Jerusalem crowd. That is what it does structurally. Pilate is presented as reluctant, manoeuvred, washing his hands. The decision is placed in the mouths of the people. And it does not take much imagination to see why Christian communities living inside the Roman Empire, communities that, after the year 70, badly needed not to be confused with Jewish revolutionaries, would find that shape of the story useful. I am not telling you the evangelists were liars. I am telling you what a great many serious scholars, including believing ones, will tell you, that these are documents written by people with purposes, at a moment of enormous political danger, and that the shape of a narrative is evidence about its author as well as about its subject. So we have a scene that may be doing at least 3 things at once: recording something, preaching something, and protecting somebody. That is a lot of freight for one man to carry out of one cell, and it explains, I think, why nobody followed him. Because in every layer of the story, the ritual layer, the theological layer, the political layer, the released man's function is complete the moment he is released. He is the goat sent away. He is the contrast that makes the exchange visible. He is the crowd's verdict made flesh. Nobody follows the scapegoat into the wilderness. The whole point is that it goes. Part 10. The stones he would have seen. Let us leave the arguments for a while and stand in the place. I cannot tell you what Barabbas looked like, and I am not going to invent him. But I can tell you, with reasonable confidence, what the mourning around him was made of. Because that, unlike the man, has been excavated. Start with where the trial happened, because the answer is probably not the one you were taught. If you have walked the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem, you began at a spot associated with the Antonia fortress, on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. That tradition is genuinely old, but it is not as old as it feels. The sequence of stations as pilgrims walk it today was fixed in the medieval period centuries after the events. The current scholarly consensus points somewhere else, to Herod's palace, on the western hill of the city, near where the Tower of David and the Jaffa Gate stand today. The reasoning is straightforward. Both Josephus and Philo indicate that Roman governors, when they came up to Jerusalem, stayed in Herod's palace. That is where the seat of authority was. The archaeologist Shimon Gibson has stated the consensus plainly, that scholars broadly agree Herod's palace on the west of the city was the Praetorium, and that the trial took place in its vicinity. Excavations under the old Ottoman prison compound beside the Tower of David have exposed Herodian palace remains, and those excavations got a good deal of attention about a decade ago for exactly this reason. The Antonia, meanwhile, looks increasingly like what its function suggests, a fortress and barracks overlooking the temple courts, useful for watching a crowd, too modest to serve as a governor's residence. And then there is the pavement. John's Gospel says that Pilate brought Jesus out and sat down at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Hebrew Gabbatha, and there is a magnificent expanse of ancient paving stones in Jerusalem, beneath the convent of the Sisters of Zion, grooved and worn, that generations of pilgrims have been shown as that very floor. The specialists date it to about the year 135. It appears to be the flagstone floor of a forum built when the Emperor Hadrian refounded Jerusalem as a Roman colony after the Second Jewish Revolt, laid over an earlier water reservoir, a relationship confirmed by excavation in the 1960s. It is a genuine and impressive Roman pavement, It is almost certainly not the one John describes. There may well have been an earlier paved area in that vicinity. We cannot demonstrate it. I mention this not to spoil anyone's pilgrimage, but because it is a good example of how this material actually works. The stones are real, the devotion is real, the identification is later than both. Now the machinery of the morning. Pilate was exercising what Roman lawyers called cognitio extra ordinem, the wide discretionary judicial power of a provincial governor over people who were not Roman citizens. There was no jury. There were no rules of evidence as we would recognize them. The governor heard the matter and decided it, and in a province like Judea he held the power of the sword. He could order an execution. Roman imprisonment, in this world, was overwhelmingly custodial rather than punitive. You were not sentenced to prison, you were held in it, pending a hearing or an execution. Which means Barabbas was not serving a term. He was waiting. Mark's participle describes him as bound. Where exactly he was held we do not know, most likely in holding cells within the governor's residence, or in the fortress. But no source tells us, and I will not guess. Around all of it, the city at Passover. Estimates of Jerusalem's ordinary resident population in this period vary a great deal. You will see ranges from perhaps 30 or 40,000 up to 80 or 100,000. And specialists argue about it. What nobody argues about is that at Passover the city swelled enormously with pilgrims. Josephus gives a number, and I want to hand it to you with a warning attached. He says that at one Passover the priests counted the lambs sacrificed, and reached 256,500, and reckoning 10 people to a lamb, arrives at a total of over 2,700,000 people in the city. That figure is not credible as a census. The city could not physically hold it, and ancient writers used large numbers rhetorically in ways we do not. But it tells you what Passover felt like to a man who had lived through it. A city bursting, nationalist feeling at its yearly peak, Rome reinforcing the garrison and putting soldiers on the porticos of the temple, precisely because this was the week when things went wrong. That is the room, and that is the street, and that is the crowd noise. And into it, on one such morning, a bound man was brought out, and stood beside another bound man, and a Roman official asked a shouting crowd to choose. And then the doors of the record close. Part 11. The silence, and the men who filled it. Here is where I have to do the thing this channel exists to do, which is to tell you the truth, even when the truth is a blank page. There is no ancient tradition about what happened to Barabbas. None, not a canonical verse, not a patristic remark, not an apocryphal gospel, not a Syriac chronicle, not a rabbinic notice, not a Roman record. The church fathers who discuss him, Origen, Cyril, discuss what he means. Not one of them tells us that he died anywhere, converted to anything, went anywhere, or was ever seen again. If you go looking online, you will find claims. You will find it said that Barabbas died in the destruction of Jerusalem, that he became a follower of Jesus, that he was martyred in Rome, that he watched the crucifixion from the edge of the crowd and was undone by it. Every one of those is modern. Not one has an ancient source behind it. And I want you to be able to recognize where they came from, because the story of how the blank got filled is itself a good story. In October of 1893, the English novelist Marie Corelli published a book called Barabbas, A Dream of the World's Tragedy. Corelli is largely forgotten now, which is remarkable, because in her own day she outsold nearly everyone. Her sales are commonly said to have exceeded those of Arthur Conan Doyle, H. G. Wells, and Rudyard Kipling combined. The book retells the Passion from the released man's point of view. It gave him relationships, an interior life, a reckoning. It went through edition after edition. including an American printing advertised as limited to 100,000 copies, which tells you something about the appetite. Every bit of its plot is invention. Then, in 1950, the Swedish writer Per Lagerkvist published a short novel called simply Barabbas. It follows the released man through the rest of his life. He cannot stop returning to what happened. He is enslaved in the copper mines. He drifts toward and away from the Christians, and he dies on a cross in Rome during the persecutions. The following year, Lagerkvist was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, and this book was at the centre of the award. The Swedish Academy described the figure at the heart of it as a believer without faith, which is one of the finest phrases anyone has ever attached to this man. It is also fiction, and Lagerkvist never pretended otherwise. It is a novel about doubt, written in the shadow of the Second World War, using a gospel silence as a room to work in. Then came the films, a Swedish adaptation in 1953, and then, in 1961, the one most people half remember, Anthony Quinn, in a big Italian production, with an invented arc that sends the man into the gladiatorial arena, a sequence that is not in the novel it claims to adapt, and certainly not in any gospel. A television version followed decades later, so when someone tells you that Barabbas was crucified in Rome, they are not repeating an ancient tradition. They are, at 3 or 4 removes, repeating a Swedish novelist. And I do not say that with contempt. I say it because the pattern is worth seeing clearly. This man has been a blank screen for 18 centuries, and human beings cannot look at a blank screen without projecting something onto it. Every generation has given him the ending that generation needed. The Victorians gave him a moral awakening. The post-war Europeans gave him existential doubt. Hollywood gave him a sword. Scripture gave him nothing. And I have come to think that the nothing is the most honest thing in the whole account. That the silence is not a gap in the story, but a feature of it. Because think about what it would mean if we did have his ending. If some 2nd century writer had supplied us with a satisfying conclusion, the murderer who fell at the foot of the cross, the rebel who died a believer, it would resolve everything. It would make the exchange tidy. It would turn a terrible morning into a lesson with a bow on it. Instead, the text does something much harder. It says a guilty man went free, and then it refuses to tell you whether it meant anything to him. That is not the shape of a legend. Legends do not leave their loose ends untied. It is the shape of a memory, the shape of something that actually happened to somebody, remembered by people who cared intensely about one of the 2 men in that scene, and evidently not at all about the other. And there is a last thing, which I will leave with you rather than argue. If the reading in those old copies is right, if the name in Matthew's Gospel was Jesus Barabbas, then, on that morning, 2 men stood in front of a Roman governor, and they had the same name, and they were named for the same thing, Son of the Father. And a crowd was asked to say which one it wanted. One of them we have followed for 2,000 years, through 4 Gospels and a library of commentary and the argument of nations. The other walked out into the sunlight, and we have never found so much as a footprint. We do not know if he understood what had happened. We do not know if he heard the noise from the hill outside the walls that afternoon, or if he was already gone. We do not know if he lived a long life, or a short one, or whether he ever told anyone. The record simply lets him go, the way the ritual lets the goat go, out past the last house into open country, until the figure is too small to see. But there is a thread left hanging in this story, and it leads somewhere. 3 crosses were prepared that morning. One of them was empty of the man it had been made ready for. And beside the cross that mattered, 2 others were raised. 2 men the Gospels call by the very same word John used for Barabbas. 2 rebels. two condemned men who, unlike him, did not walk away. And one of them, according to Luke, said something in the last hour of his life that has never stopped troubling readers, and the traditions that grew up afterward around those two men, the names later Christians gave them, and what the earlier sources actually say about who they were, is a story that begins exactly where this one ends. I will see you there.